Hello, everyone, and welcome to our module on ego defenses. As many of you probably learned in a high school or college class, Sigmund Freud, who is shown here in this picture, said that there were three parts to the human psyche or the human mind. The first part was the id. This is our desire, so we may want money or food or sex, and our id drives these desires. The second part was our superego. These were the rules of society and morality. So even though we may want money and we see it in front of us at a bank, we know that we cannot take it because that is against the rules of society. Our superego tells us that. And then finally, the third part of the psyche is the ego. So this is the mediator between the id and the superego. So the id may want money, the superego may know that there are rules about how you obtain money, and the ego comes up with a plan to mediate between those two. So if you understand that, then it's very easy to understand what ego defenses are. These are adjustments in our perception of reality. They're mostly unconscious, and what they do is resolve and manage conflict between the id and the superego. So for example, if our id wants to have lots of money, but it is impossible for us to get it based on societal rules, that may be so hard for us to handle that our ego comes up with a defense that's not realistic, but it allows our mind to live with the fact that we can't rectify the differences between our id and our superego. So the point of ego defenses is to minimize anxiety and adapt to stressful circumstances where what we want and what we can get are in conflict. So now I'll just go through all the ego defenses. These are fairly straightforward. They come up on all the STEP exams. They come up on the medicine exams, on the psych shelf exams. And what they're going to do is describe a patient's behavior in a question and ask you which ego defense is being employed by that patient. So the first one we'll talk about is acting out. This is an ego defense where people avoid emotions through bad behavior. The bad behavior may be attention seeking, it may be socially inappropriate. So for example, if a child has sick parents, that child may misbehave in school. This is called acting out. The child can't resolve the conflict between the fact that he wants his parents to be well, but they are sick, and as a result, he acts out and behaves badly in school. Another example is an adolescent who engages in promiscuous sex during her parents' divorce. He or she does not want her parents to get divorced, but they can't resolve that conflict, so therefore they engage in promiscuous sex, and that's an example of acting out. Denial, most people are familiar with. This is refusing to accept an unpleasant reality. So for example, a doctor tells a patient he has heart disease and he says that can't be true. He drops down and does 20 push-ups. That patient is in denial. May also be a heavy drinker who believes she only drinks socially, even though she's consuming 10 or 20 beers per night, and often getting in trouble for her behavior during the time when she's inebriated. Displacement is directing your emotions to another person. So the classic example of this is a patient who gets angry at a doctor after an injury. He's very mad at himself for crashing a car or falling off a ladder, but he can't handle that anger with himself, so instead he lashes out at the doctor. He is displacing his anger onto another person. Dissociation is a detachment from reality. There are a number of psychiatric dissociative disorders, which I talk about in another video. But basically, dissociation means feeling like you are outside of your body and feeling like the world is no longer real. This often happens after a triggering event, like someone who is raped and they can't cope with the fact that they have been raped, and therefore they feel like they detach or dissociate from themselves. When you examine a patient who is dissociated, they may appear detached with a flat affect. They may lose track of time. And once again, they will often say they feel like they are outside of their body. Many times people identify dissociation retrospectively. So after they recover from a serious event like a rape or physical assault, months or years later, when they look back, they will say, I dissociated after that event, meaning that they just stepped outside of their body because the reality was so difficult to handle. Repression is sometimes called motivated forgetting. So this involves forgetting one particular memory or fact. For example, if someone was physically assaulted and psychologically traumatized by that, they may repress the memory. This is an ego defense so that the person doesn't have to continue to cope and live with that memory. This is often something that happened long ago. A patient will repress a difficult period of their childhood. This was the first defense mechanism that Freud ever described, and he thought that people repress their memories to avoid guilt. So for example, if someone was abused as a child, they may feel guilty and feel like they brought that on themselves. And that is so hard to cope with that they repress the memory and do not recall what happened when they were a child. Fixation is a failure to develop beyond a childhood growth stage. So Freud described a number of growth stages in children, and if a person gets stuck in one of these stages, they are said to be fixated or fixed in that stage. For example, you may be familiar with the oral phase in children when they suck their thumbs. So if someone has an oral fixation, this means even into adolescence and adulthood, they still suck their thumbs or eat or chew pencils. They are fixated on the oral phase. Another example would be an adult who lives with his mother and depends on her. That person is fixated in a childhood stage and has not advanced beyond it. Idealization is emphasizing positive thoughts and memories and de-emphasizing negative thoughts and memories. This is classically done with childhood events, like an adult saying, "Our family vacations were always amazing," when they weren't. My father tends to do this. He thinks all our vacations when I was young were great, and he forgets that I fought with my sister for 6 hours in the back of the car. Identification is mimicking the behavior of someone else to relieve anxiety. This can be positive or negative. So, for example, if a child is anxious at school or at home and he begins behaving like the school bully with his sister, he's identifying with the school bully and he's taking on that person's habits to try and make himself feel better. And obviously, this is not a good thing. Another example may be a child who goes to a new school and begins behaving like the other children. This could actually be positive. This may be a way of fitting in. The child is identifying with the other children and modifying his or her behavior to be more like them. Intellectualization is avoiding emotions through reasoning. So, for example, if someone is getting a divorce, and instead of saying they are sad about the divorce, they cite divorce statistics to show how common divorce is in the world at large. This person is intellectualizing. They are trying to avoid their feelings by talking about the fine details, the scientific facts, and other elements of the thing that they are going through. Isolation refers to isolating a distressing memory or event and taking away the emotional aspect of that memory or event. Patients who isolate fail to experience the emotions of events, and they will describe something traumatizing like a rape or an assault without expressing sadness. Basically, just describe the event with mechanical detail. That person has isolated that memory and has walled it off from their emotional psyche. Passive aggression is something most of us are familiar with. This is when a person conflicts with someone else in a non-confrontational manner. So, for example, if a husband is mad at his wife, he doesn't want to say, "I'm mad at you," so instead he acts uncooperative. He is being passively aggressive. In other words, he's not directly confronting her and being aggressive. Instead, he's being aggressive in some other manner. And you'll see this with lots of people you work with. They will be unhappy about something you did, but they don't want to come up and confront you about it. So instead, they do other things to show you that they are angry. They are engaging in passive aggressive behavior. Projection is attributing your own feelings or emotions to others. So if you feel or think something that you can't handle, instead of acknowledging that you feel this thing, you project it onto someone else. So, for example, a cheater who feels guilty because he is cheating will accuse a classmate of cheating, or a man who has homosexual impulses will accuse another man of being attracted to him. And projection is very common in medical school. Most of the people who accuse other people of being gunners are actually gunners themselves. You'll see this throughout your medical career. People who are afraid of making mistakes will accuse others of making mistakes. They are all projecting. Rationalization means distorting events so the outcome is positive. For example, someone who says, "I'm glad I got fired, I actually needed a change." They are rationalizing what happened to them so they don't feel so badly about it. Reaction formation basically means doing the opposite of what you think or feel. Reaction formation means engaging in the opposite behavior. That's the reaction to unwanted feelings that you have. So, for example, a man who craves alcohol may go around preaching abstinence. He is engaging in reaction formation. A woman who despises her mother may throw her mother a birthday party. Another example is a parent who despises their child. Maybe it's an unwanted child, but they show extreme love and affection to the child because they can't handle their true feelings, which is that they regret that they have this child. Regression means reverting to behavior of a younger person or child. So, for example, if an adult is stressed out and goes back to watching cartoons from his or her childhood, that could be considered an example of regression. Or if a sick adult wants a parent to stay in the hospital room with them and cuddle with them, that's another example of regression. Splitting is the categorization of others at extremes. So a person who likes to split can't handle that there are gray zones and that people can be both good and bad depending on what they are doing. So he or she will split and describe everyone as either wonderful or horrible. Even the same person may be wonderful one day and horrible the next. That is splitting. Or, for example, the patient may love her doctor but hate her nurse. That patient is splitting those he or she encounters in their environment. And this is very common in borderline personality disorder, and I talk about this more in the video on personality disorders. Sublimation means using negative emotions in a positive way. So, for example, a person who is anxious could become a security guard and sit in a room with video cameras monitoring everything around the person so that they feel safe. Another example is a person who knows that he or she is aggressive, so they become a boxer so they can let out their aggression. These are examples of sublimation. Altruism is the practice of concerns for others to relieve anxiety in your own life. So, for example, if you care for someone who is sick, this may help you to reduce stress and anxiety in your own life about disease and mortality. Cancer survivors often help others with the same disease, and this helps them feel better about the fact that they survived cancer and maybe the fact that it might come back at some later point in their life. Suppression is a conscious defense mechanism that patients do intentionally to relieve stress and anxiety. When a person engages in suppression, they ignore stressful thoughts and feelings to cope. A person who is suppressing things will say, I'm not going to think about that now. And this is in contrast to repression we talked about earlier. That is an unconscious defense mechanism. Patients don't do that on purpose. Suppression is done on purpose, and you may do this in your own life where you know that a certain aspect of your life is stressful and that it can't be resolved in the near term, so you're just going to ignore it for the time being. That is actually a healthy defense mechanism, and that is called suppression. Humor is another healthy defense mechanism where people relieve anxiety with jokes or laughter. So, for example, you may have medical student friends who make jokes when they are bored studying. This helps to relieve anxiety, and this is another ego defense. I'll finish with this slide and mention that all of these ego defenses can be divided into those that are mature and those that are immature. The four that I've shown on this slide are called mature defenses, and that's because they usually don't impair social functioning, and in many cases, they help improve social functioning. The other defense mechanisms we talked about in this video tend to get in the way of social functioning. They tend to make people feel worse, not better, and therefore those are called immature defenses. And that concludes our video on defense mechanisms.